Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Often there's a problem with the microphones. At least I seem to have a problem. All right. My name is John Herbst. I am the director of the Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center. And thank you all very much for coming for today's event. My job right now is to introduce Bridget Brink, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State Department. Bridget's bio you have, so I will not repeat anything there. Let me just mention that she just came back from Kyiv, so she has the latest information. And also, as a representative of the administration, she has some very interesting things to say. And with that, I'll turn the podium over to Bridget. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much, Atlantic Council. Thank you very much, Ambassador Herbst. It's such an honor to be here with so many dedicated and knowledgeable colleagues. Thanks to Ambassador Chali. I know he had to leave to go to St. Louis this afternoon, and to all of you distinguished guests. When I talked to Ambassador Herbst about contributing to this conference and about being on a panel, I suggested being on the conflict panel because, as he mentioned, I just came back from Ukraine and also Eastern Ukraine, and I'm glad to talk about that. And then he suggested I contribute to the keynote, which I'm really honored to do. So I thank you for that, and my remarks are going to be a little broader than at least in this segment. And thinking what I would say to this very august group, I wanted to step back a moment and to consider why we are all here. And I thought about it, and I often think about what my family in the Midwest says when I tell them what I'm doing and where I'm going and what I work on. And they say, "Why are you doing this?" Not all of them, but some. The answer is because Ukraine's success is also America's success. There are some principles that I want to highlight which underscore the U.S. approach to Ukraine, but also importantly, I'm responsible in terms of the State Department for U.S. foreign policy to countries other than Ukraine, but including Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Belarus, and Moldova. But there are some principles that underlie our approach, the U.S. approach to this region in particular, that I just wanted to underscore. One, that every country has the right to chart its own future. Two, borders cannot be changed by force. And three, supporting democracies, meaning support for rule of law, civil society, free media, also equals and helps the United States build partners to fight global threats and also investment opportunities for U.S. businesses, among other strategic interests. So I come back to success for Ukraine means success for the United States. A Ukraine with strong institutions, free of corruption, provides an important partner to the United States. A stable and secure Ukraine that respects the rule of law is also attractive for U.S. business. And a successful Ukraine sends a strong message to Russia's other neighbors who see their future, as we do, as part of a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace. So where does this leave us on Ukraine policy? Many often ask me. It leaves us strongly supporting Ukraine. You've probably seen the Vice President's remarks during his speech at the Munich Security Conference in February. Maybe some of you were also there, where he said, "We must continue to hold Russia accountable and demand that they honor the Minsk Agreements, beginning by de-escalating the violence in eastern Ukraine." Other administration officials, including President Trump, Ambassador Haley, and most recently Secretary Tillerson, have also been strong in public about U.S. support for Ukraine. Here's what my Secretary of State said at the NATO-Ukraine Council meeting, Commission meeting last Friday in Brussels. "Allies stand firm in our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We do not and will not accept Russian efforts to change the borders of the territory of Ukraine. We support Germany and France's work to find a diplomatic solution to the ongoing crisis in eastern Ukraine. And we are alarmed by the escalating violence and call on Russia to exercise its influence over the separatists to stop the violence and attacks on the OSCE monitors and facilitate their access." As Ambassador Herbst said, I recently returned from a 6-day trip to Kyiv, Kramatorsk, and Slovyansk, and had the chance to meet with many Ukrainian officials, NGO activists, members of the Rada, OSCE monitors, and many others. I would like to talk more as useful on the details of the situation in eastern Ukraine, which I think is very disconcerting. I do hope this April 1st ceasefire recommitment actually works, but the history of those is not very good. But I want to share a couple of sort of summary thoughts. One is that the violence is at its highest levels recorded by the OSCE, which is quite disturbing for us and I think for all of you. That the OSCE monitor safety is also increasingly at risk with more and more aggressive physical attacks against the monitors and threats against the monitors, and that the threat to civilian infrastructure, which could potentially affect a huge number of people, is real and serious. So from our perspective, and again, as Secretary Tillerson made clear last Friday with NATO allies, there needs to be a visible, verifiable, and irreversible improvement in the security situation in eastern Ukraine. Our position on Crimea remains the same. We won't recognize Russia's occupation. So while security is absolutely critical, what is no less important to Ukraine's success is success in its effort to reform. I know many of you are supporting that, actually. The leaders of Ukraine, the reformers inside and outside of government, and many people here deserve a huge amount of credit for how far Ukraine has come, especially under the circumstances of the conflict in the east and the occupation of Crimea. I want to offer my congratulations to Ukrainian colleagues for the IMF board decision to release $1 billion, which is also a signal of international support and endorsement for Ukraine's reform path. Ukraine has restored its public finances and achieved macroeconomic stability. It's strengthened the economy, enabling it to grow in 2016 after 3 years of recession. It reduced the budget deficit and tripled foreign exchange reserves to $16 billion. 2016 was the first year since independence that Ukraine did not buy gas directly from Russia. So, in the context of all these accomplishments, still, there's a lot more that needs to be done. First, reduce reliance on Russian gas to strengthen energy security. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, which would concentrate about 80% of European gas imports from Russia on a single route, poses a real threat to European and Ukrainian energy security. Pension reform and land reform, this is going to be a key couple of reforms, obviously difficult political reforms, but key to moving forward, including with the next IMF tranche. Ukraine must complete transparent privatizations of state-owned enterprises. Repeated and unfortunately failed attempts at privatization send the wrong signal to potential investors. From our perspective, Kyiv could be better and more transparent to ensure better and more transparent governance of other state-owned enterprises, especially in the energy and the defense sectors. And we strongly encourage this privately and publicly. But most importantly, and this I want to underscore here, and it's something that I spoke a lot about with colleagues and counterparts in Kyiv, is that Ukraine must accelerate efforts to combat corruption, including establishing an independent anti-corruption court and giving the NABU the powers it needs to fulfill its mandate. Corruption is what drove Ukrainians to the Maidan. Combating corruption credibly will help restore Ukrainians' faith in its government. So to conclude, there has been huge progress and huge potential. But to realize all of this for Ukraine and for the United States, it needs your and our continued support with regard to getting the security situation into a better place, supporting implementation of the Minsk Agreements, and make reforms irreversible. The United States stands fully with Ukraine in these efforts, and thank you very much for the chance to speak with you today.
Thank you all for joining us. It's a great conference at a really important time, not only for Ukraine, but for U.S. policy toward the region. My name is Mark Simakovsky. I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. The topic today is obviously on Ukraine-Russia conflict, a path to resolution or freezing. We're joined with probably the perfect group to discuss this issue. To my left, Bridget Brink, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, who covers the region. And I am lucky enough to say I've worked with Bridget not only in the region but also back here in Washington for the last two administrations. And there's probably no one better to focus on these issues and to advise the new administration on how to proceed with this region. To her left, Ambassador John Herbst, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine and the head of the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council, and just a distinguished leader on these issues, both here domestically and abroad. To his left, Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. She's been focused on this region and is actually going to Ukraine today, so it'll be very interesting to hear her thoughts. And it's an honor for me, as someone who is also a first-generation American with Ukrainian background, to have Ambassador Dobriansky here, who's got a great heritage tied to Ukraine. To her left, Dr. Alexander Litvinenko, the Deputy Secretary of the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council. He's worked for over 20 years in outside government in Ukraine, and is going to have plenty of discussions here in Washington with the U.S. government on these issues. Finally, Mr. Alexei Melnik, Co-Director of Foreign Relations and International Security Programs at the Razumkov Center in Kiev. Congratulate him on his work and his center's leadership on these issues. I traveled to Ukraine about a decade ago, and that was my first stop in Kiev, was to the Razumkov Center. As you all know, Russia's aggression in Ukraine, including the first change of borders in Europe since World War II, represents a new strategic reality in the region. The standing ceasefire in Ukraine is in name only, as violence continues, with continued escalations, and Russia's move to establish its position on the ground, and also to further integrate the Donbass into Russia. Secretary Tillerson travels to Moscow next week. The date's been announced on April 12th, where Ukraine is listed as the top issue that will be of discussion during his meetings. My first question to all of you is particularly on the conflict and the status and the trajectory of where you see it. In particular, the future of the Minsk Accords. And as the label of this panel questions, whether freezing the conflict is in the interests of not only Ukraine, but the United States, particularly considering Russia's historical role in freezing many other separatist conflicts in the region to its advantage. And I'd love to start at the end of our panel with Mr. Melnik and get a Ukrainian perspective.
Thank you, Chair. My answer will be very short. If the freezing is a good option, if we consider the other options, what are the other options? Either escalation or resolution of the conflict, since the resolution of this conflict is unlikely in the near future, and the other option is not probably very attractive. I would say that the freezing of the conflict is probably the best we can achieve in, let's say, coming months or years.
Please.
First of all, I am very thankful for this invitation. I'm apologize for my very Ukrainian English, but I hope it help you to understand the situation. When we are speaking about what kind of freezing conflict we can discuss right now, now we see a real escalation of the violence. Russian aggression has two main dimensions. The first, battle on the Donbass, and as Ambassador Charlie said, we lost at least 17 our soldiers and officers for last 2 weeks. And the second very important Russian aggression dimension is a subversive campaign. Only for last week, we saw 2 assassinations where Mr. Voronenkov, Russian, flew from Moscow, and Ukrainian officer of counterintelligence who were killed in Mariupol. And in this day, we see a huge diversion in Ukrainian munition storage in Balaklia, when Russian subverts and destroyed a huge Ukrainian capacity of munition. I think now we have to say about de-escalation and full implementation of security block of Minsk Agreement. I mentioned about ceasefire. I mentioned about withdraw Russian troops, withdraw weaponry, and release of hostage.
On the point of freezing the conflict, I would say I don't see that as a solution. I see that as maybe a Band-Aid, but not a solution to what has transpired on the ground. Fundamentally, you have not only the military aspect, which you've addressed, but you also have the political consequences. I know when I was last in Kiev, there were many Ukrainians who had raised with me what will happen to their voting rights, what will happen to their ownership of their homes in the region. And one cannot leave that just hanging. It's part of their country, it's part of their future. And then there's also not only the military and the political, but there's also the humanitarian. There are 2.5 million people who have been displaced. By freezing a situation, again, you're not addressing many of the circumstances which have caused instability and disruption. I see it as in everyone's interest that there is a solution that's a ceasefire, it's a military solution, the borders are secured for Ukraine, its sovereignty is in its hands, and that these political questions as well as humanitarian questions are addressed and resolved. It's not only in Ukraine's interest, it's in Europe's interest, it's in Russia's interest, it's in a global interest, because what happens there does have ramifications not just for the region, but beyond.
3 points. First, Alexei is right that a frozen conflict would be better than what you have right now. So as an interim step, that would not be a bad thing. 2, on Minsk. Minsk is deeply imperfect, but it has been the vehicle by which the Europeans have maintained sanctions on the Kremlin. So that's a net plus. 3, it's very important that even if we were able to achieve an actual ceasefire, that the pressure remain on the Kremlin so that we get to the solution that Paul outlined, meaning Ukraine has full control of the Donbass, control of the border.
First of all, thanks a lot, and thanks to Mark, who's my longtime friend and colleague for many years, and who was a star in the past and still is now. I would just say, from the U.S., from the administration position, the Minsk Agreements may be imperfect, but they are the only thing that all parties to the conflict have agreed. They also contain all of the elements which one would need to resolve the conflict. And in that respect, they are important, they are worth supporting, and we would like to see an acceleration of their implementation. And that will start with security.
May I add two
Absolutely.
variables
Absolutely.
just in this that I didn't mention on Minsk, because I focus more on freezing the conflict and not on a front game, but on an end game. On Minsk, just 2 points. It might be worth injecting in our analysis of Minsk going forward the fact that we have the French elections and also the German elections. And the outcome of those elections also can have bearing on the Minsk Agreement and the way in which it goes forward. So I'm just injecting that in here. And another point is I know that at times some experts, there are different positions on this, and not to detract from the strong roles that Europe has played in this, but also some have injected in looking forward, what role should the United States play? Should it play a more direct role in and at the table in a solution?
Let's move to that section of the remarks, is focusing on the U.S. role and the European role in resolving the conflict. President Trump came into office on Russia issues potentially as the the most talked about aspect of his foreign policy, and trying to showcase a willingness to reset or improve the relationship with Moscow. There was many concerns, both because of the campaign's unique and disconcerting role with Russia during the campaign, that Ukraine would be the cost of improved U.S.-Russian relations. At least so far, because of the political scandal that is going on internally here in the United States, there has been a boxing in of the administration and its ability to change its approach to Russia. And people like the UN ambassador and now Secretary Tillerson at the NATO-Ukraine Commission last week have made some very strong statements about the staying power of U.S. commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity. Can you comment on not only the role of the United States and its importance to resolving the conflict, whether the United States should play a more active role in diplomacy in resolving the conflict, potentially taking a role alongside its French and German counterparts? And then lastly, because of the staying power of transatlantic unity on sanctions, the role of French and German elections potentially in breaking that unity if we get a candidate in either country who is not as committed to sanctions as before. And if possible, I'd love to start with you, Bridget, and get a U.S. perspective.
I would just start off by saying this. I wouldn't necessarily share that analysis. From my perspective and from the administration perspective, and even previous administrations also, we believe that it would be a good thing to have a better relationship with Russia and to be able to work with Russia on areas of shared interests. And that is something that I know the President and our Secretary are all committed to. And as you mentioned, the Secretary announced his visit to Moscow, which is going to come up on April 12th. And Ukraine, among other things, are going to be key parts of that. So we think that that's an important thing for the United States. And as we consider what the policy is, and as in every administration, thinking through what will the policy be in its detail and what are the foundations, I just go back to the principles that I mentioned in the opening remarks about U.S. position of no change of borders by force, about countries' ability to chart their own future, and about the United States support for countries developing democratically, because those democratic countries tend to be the countries with which we can fight global threats and which are the most open to U.S. investment and business. With regard to your questions and Ambassador Dobryansky's mention of the European elections, obviously, yes, the elections, I think, are something we're all watching. I mean, it's not up to us in the United States in terms of the future of France or Germany, but they will have an impact, I think, on the approaches toward Ukraine. But what I can say is that we have, and I expect will continue to work very closely with the French and the Germans, who are part of the Normandy format, together with the Russians and the Ukrainians, to try to help implement Minsk. How exactly we do that, I think that's something still not quite determined, but we're all very focused on results. And by results, I mean moving implementation of Minsk forward, but most importantly, starting with security. And to do security, it might be one of your questions later, I think we need more than just a ceasefire. I think from our perspective, the ceasefires have been tried, but they don't hold. And there's going to have to be more than that is going to help us unlock the full implementation of Minsk.
I'd like to come at your questions from a slightly different optic. I think if you go back to, say, the beginning of the year, as one looked at the defense of Ukraine, there was real reasons for pessimism. You had a president-elect who was more Neville Chamberlain than Winston Churchill. You had an impending election in the Netherlands, and then, of course, in France and in Germany, where we thought that people who did not understand the security dimensions of Russian revisionism might become leaders. But as you've already mentioned, Mark, whatever instincts President Trump has, he's been boxed in, thank goodness. The elections in the Netherlands turned out well. It's highly likely that the elections in France will turn out well. And I think it's nearly certain, because both major candidates in Germany are okay on this issue, that the German elections will turn out well. Even if somehow Marie Le Pen were to win the election in Paris, I suspect watching the changing of position in Germany in response to the Trump administration, we'd see stepped up German leadership to find a way to maintain sanctions.
I would just add, because I already made a reference, I'd add to the comments made about the U.S. role. I think, as Bridget had read to all of us, a part of Secretary Tillerson's remarks at the NATO meeting, I thought they were very significant in terms of what he said about holding firm on Crimea, and that we would not accept anything less than Crimea back to Ukraine. He also addressed the concern about the aggression on the Eastern Front. And again, the language that was used, I thought, was very, very clearly stated and very forthright. I do think the U.S. role matters, and it matters because what has happened in Ukraine has so many ramifications in many different areas. It challenges the international order, it challenges Ukraine's own sovereignty, and it also is something that is looked at not only just in Europe itself, but in many other parts of the world in how one deals with it. I do think that our role in this certainly matters.
I'm very thankful for Paula Dobransky for mentioning about Crimea. And from my point of view, the conflict, the Donbass is only a part of broader picture, which include annexation of Crimea, Russian subversive campaign against Ukraine, including political saboteurs, diversions, terror, includes cyber attacks, economic war, etc. This broader picture includes Russian military build-up near Ukrainian border. I am saying about 3 new divisions, 105th, 144th, and 3rd Division. I am saying about 4 new army, 49 and 8th Army of the South Military District. I am saying about 1st Tanks Army and 20th Field Army of Western Military District. I am saying about military build-up, Russian military build-up in Crimea, etc. These preparing threaten not only Ukraine. This situation threaten to European security and even global security. And I do believe that only the US, European countries can play key role for resolving, for sustainable resolving of this problem. Donbass is only bright, important, key, but only part of this situation.
Well, let me go back a little bit about the Minsk Agreement and the possible ways of resolution of the conflict. Because I think what is missing sometimes in the discussions, that, for instance, even on this panel was mentioned that the agreement was signed between the parties. Actually, it's not true, because the party to the conflict, which is the Russian Federation, as we all know, is not a party to this agreement. So, because Russia was allowed to play a role of mediator and a peacemaker during the whole process, and again, there are no Russian commitments on paper. Of course, there is something that's outside this paper, but talking about the Minsk Agreement or being or having no alternative to the Minsk Agreement, we should always keep in mind that there is no Russian commitments on paper, and Russia is not stated as a party to the conflict. It complicates this complicated process even further. The second point is about the US role and the European Union role in the resolution of the conflict. From the very, very first day of the conflict, it was not like a matter of bilateral relations between Ukraine and Russia. So I think that the United States, Europe should understand and form their own interest in the resolution of the conflict. And the assistance provided to Ukraine, which I always grateful, I take any chance to thank the people who provide assistance for our country, should be also based not on like charity approach. It should be based on national interests. Because if you look at the current NATO strategy, or current NATO approach towards Russia, it's this so-called 3D approach: defense, deterrence, and dialogue. I don't know how you can combine these three different approaches in one, but talking about defense, well, for the time being, it looks like more or less successful. Talking about deterrence, I would probably say that at a certain moment we will have to make or to reconsider this issue, how we can deter Russia, because so far we see that Russia still keeping an initiative, still pushing these red lines. Let's leave alone dialogue. But coming back again to defense, if we are talking about passive defense, that providing military assistance, either little or no little equipment for Ukraine, financial support, political support, that we are rather contributing to this passive kind of defense. If one day we start about active defense, that then Ukraine may be seen as a great asset for the West, as an instrument of active defense, or I would say offense against Russia. Because what is the main challenge for the current regime in the Kremlin? The main challenge, on the side of Ukraine, is not Ukrainian military capabilities. Ukraine had never reached even a balance with the Russian military capabilities. But if one day Ukraine can present a better model for the Russian society, it will be a real challenge for the current Russian regime. So that's, again, talking about Western and American interest in supporting Ukraine, in helping Ukraine to develop in this direction of becoming prosperous and democratic country. I think that you should think about your own interest. And my last point about U.S. role and Ukrainian expectations after or during the U.S. elections. It was a shock, let's admit, when we discovered the possible results of the American elections. But at the end of the day, it turned to be good news for Ukraine, because finally, many in Ukraine who expected that the West will come and rescue Ukraine understood that this is the Ukrainian business to take care about our country.
Before we open it up for questions, I did want to tee off Mr. Melnick's point about Russia as a party to the conflict. Russia is going, and has for the last 3 years, played the most fundamental role in developing, stewing, and continuing this conflict. As a result, Russia has the ultimate say, some would say, in the future of the conflict. And Russia, frankly, has had little incentive to change its approach, both because understanding of a transition here in the United States, and because it has been able to showcase, at least on paper, a commitment to the Minsk Agreement, where in reality the violation of the Minsk Agreement has not resulted in any change on sanctions. It has not resulted in any change on the U.S. approach to defense assistance to Ukraine, and it hasn't really changed Russia's, at least, belief that changing the conflict or resolving it is in Russia's interest at all. Considering also that Russia has looked at the Ukraine issue in a transactional approach, and as a part of a wider discussion with the United States and with the Europeans on global issues like Syria and elsewhere, I'd be very interested in your views on how Russia will be either incentivized to change its approach, either through sanctions or through defense assistance, and is there a way to incentivize Russia to get more progress on this issue without, hopefully, frankly, trading Ukraine for cooperation with Russia in another area of U.S. interest like Syria?
There was great challenge, I think, and kind of fear in Ukraine that Ukraine would be trade-off for, a kind of making deal between the U.S. and Russia. And I think it's in the past already. Is there any Russian interest in the resolution of the conflict in Ukraine? So far, I don't see any, let's say, incentives for the Russian Federation. I mean, it's absolutely logical. It's absolutely beneficial for Russia to stop this conflict. But so far, I don't see any evidences that anything can be changed in the Russian decision makers' mind. That's unfortunately what we see. But coming back again to the Minsk Agreement, everything that you said is right. But one of the shortcomings of this paper, I mean, Minsk Agreement or record, whatever it's called, that Russia not mentioned even once in the whole text of the Minsk Agreement. So there are no Russian commitments, and Russia not a party to the conflict. But having said that, I fully aware that even if we very carefully blame Russia in every chapter or every sentence for this conflict, it's not going to work, because after Russia violated dozens of international rules and dozens of bilateral agreements, I don't think that any perfect text will help the situation.
I have 2 points. First of all, when we are speaking about great bargaining, about deal, I think the most important not such deal, but implementation of this deal. When people try to compare the situation with Yalta, now it's impossible, because Yalta could be implemented in Syria, because the Soviet Union deployed 11 million army in Eastern European countries, and Yalta only formalized a real situation. Now Ukraine is not our object, but a subject of these matters. When we are speaking, the second small point, which I think is the most important, I think that we are saying we have to say not about resolution of current conflict, but about strengthening the world order, creation real strong rules and real measures which can support these rules and will not allow countries such as current Russian Federation to violate this rule. We can resolve some conflict, but after this, Russia will create the next conflict in other places. We have to resolve problems and resolve these reasons, but not the results of acting of this reason.
2 points I'll make. First, I think that Alexander's last point is extremely well taken. The fact that the liberal international order and the rules-based order by which peace, security, stability has been maintained has been challenged. And to leave it just not being defended and not having a unified and sustained approach is unfortunate. And I agree with you that it's crucial that that's a way forward, one way forward, that framework must be upheld and all must be accountable to those rules. Secondly, I had the privilege of joining the NATO Secretary General and Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, who's here, at the rollout of a report that the Secretary General, former Secretary General, had commissioned on the issue of sanctions. I thought it was very potent and very compelling, because what the report in some states is that you cannot have inaction because there are costs associated with inaction. The sanctions not only should be maintained and sustained, but should in fact be expanded. Consideration should be given to that if there is not a freezing of the conflict or an actual concrete, tangible negotiation going forward. And I only say the freezing of the conflict in the interim basis, but really a genuine indication of going forward in a direction for reconciliation and a solution here. But the point about the sanctions, they must be sustained, they must be looked at, they must be also expanded. And that was the essence of that report, and I think very, very key, because in terms of impacting Russia, I do think that there was a correlation, and one can point to how that has had an impact on a country that is dealing with some dire economic issues itself.
And if I could just quickly jump in, if, Bridget, if you respond, is sanctions increasing a potential option that Secretary Tillerson is bringing to Moscow on his trip next week?
Don't put her on the spot or anything, Mark.
I would say, so President Trump has said very early in the administration that it's too early to talk about sanctions. So I don't have more to say on that at this moment, but I would say that we're looking, as everyone has mentioned, at all of the possible ways that we could find a way forward with Russia, but with the rest of the Normandy format partners to see Minsk implemented. Maybe I'll let, is it all right? I have one more comment based on the discussion, which I thought was really interesting on this question. And I would just, again, maybe just step back a little bit, in that obviously the occupation of Crimea, Russia's aggression in eastern Ukraine has had a very shocking, palpable effect on European security and our view of European security, which obviously affects America very closely as well. But I would also look at the antecedent to this, or antecedents, and I would say that I think one of the things that we need to make sure we're looking at this is in the context of Georgia in 2008, and what that meant at that time and what that can mean in future. And so our reaction in terms of Ukraine is one that is in that broader context in my mind, since Mark and I actually lived through some of the 2008 in Georgia together. But what is happening with Russia and its periphery and its neighborhood is one that, from a U.S. security perspective, is one that is against our security in terms of not respecting the territorial integrity of its neighbors and the sovereignty of its neighbors and the choices of its neighbors. So some of the things that we have called out with regard to what's happening just publicly are things such as in eastern Ukraine, it's the recognition of the separatist documentation. It's the declaration of a so-called border along the line of contact. It's the nationalization of industries. But also, if you look at, for example, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, it's the integration of the Abkhaz and South Ossetian military forces into the Russian military. It's the integration of other structures in South Ossetia and Abkhazia into Russia. It's elections that are happening in South Ossetia and a referendum there that's coming up, and then the previous elections in Abkhazia. Also, Transnistria is another case in point. So anyway, there are many examples, and I think to look at this, it's important to look at it in this broader perspective, because it also underlines why from the U.S. perspective and from the administration perspective, it's really important to have very clear messaging. And the Secretary did announce today his travel to Moscow, and part of that announcement is to have a clear and open conversation with Russia on Ukraine and on a broader set of issues as well.
I think the conversation so far has been too sour. Because in fact, while Ukraine has vulnerabilities and Ukraine is hurting as a result of the Russian war in the east, Russia also has vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities are the fact that the sanctions have taken 1 to 1.5% of their GDP in 2015. We don't have the figures yet for 16. The other vulnerabilities that Putin cannot afford to have Russian soldiers dead, because the Russian people don't want Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine. So what that means for us is we should increase the costs on him for his adventure in Ukraine. Now, Bridget correctly broadened the conversation to talk about the near abroad. We should also broaden it further to talk about NATO. So it's very much a vital American interest as a forward defense of NATO to impose greater cost on the Kremlin for its aggression in Ukraine. And those greater costs would come, for example, by increasing sanctions. That's probably not possible in the current environment, either in Washington or in Europe. The other thing we could do is provide serious weapons to Ukraine to fight the Kremlin. Those weapons should include more counter-battery radars. We're already providing this, which will greatly reduce Ukrainian casualties and increase Russian casualties. We should provide javelins, which will kill Russian tanks, which have been essential for Russian land grabs. And we should also consider providing Bradley fighting vehicles. We have lots of these in storage. We can provide them to Ukraine at no cost to ourselves. If we do these things, the cost for Mr. Putin of his excellent adventure in Ukraine will go way up, and we will be in a position to help Ukraine reclaim the Donbass.
Thanks. With that, we want to save plenty of time for questions. Open the floor. Please.
Deputy Chief of Mission of Ukraine. Thank you very much, Deputy Assistant Secretary Brink, for your continuous support and for your personal very strong engagement in supporting Ukraine. Thank you very much, Ambassador Herbst, Ambassador Dobransky, for your very loud expert voice in support of Ukraine. I would like to reiterate the message from my colleagues that building defense of Ukraine and increasing deterrence capacity is very important, not only for Ukraine, but for the entire international security, and we believe for the interest of the United States. Let me just draw like few examples that the brigade, the 72nd Brigade that was trained with the assistance of the United States was the one that very effectively repelled aggression in Avdiivka, and that was done with U.S. efforts. And we hear continuously that trainings that take place in Ukraine are not only helpful for Ukraine, but it's also a good opportunity for the United States to get the first-hand experience about how to face and how to combat against the cyber threats and the 21st century threats. So we believe it's a very good exercise for both countries, and this is something that can build up the deterrence capacity in future and can certainly help in facing such challenges. And on the, if you allow me a short comment on your question about possibility for the Secretary's visit. I just wanted to thank very much the great Ukrainian-American community, and namely the Ukrainian Congressional Committee of America, who signed and issued an open letter to Secretary Tillerson inviting him to Ukraine before the potential and the possible visits more eastwards. So thank you very much. That was a comment, sorry, no questions.
Sorry, I'm very thankful for Oksana for your comments, and I have one point. Ukraine need not help, but cooperation and a real partnership. And the exercise and training of Ukrainian soldiers, it's a brilliant example of this kind of help, of this kind of partnership. When the U.S. support Ukrainian military reform, Ukrainian civil security sector reform, U.S. make a brilliant investment for deterring Russia and develop our country as a real example of successful development in Eastern Europe. It's a huge investment in the future, in the development not only Ukraine, but all Eastern Europe and Russia as well. Thank you.
if anyone else wants to answer. Otherwise, we'll keep moving. Questions? There's a large
I'm going
interest.
to make just a footnote.
Yep.
I think you underscore, Oksana, the fact that there isn't one silver bullet for influencing the situation. It does mention what's done politically in terms of the rules-based order. I think it does matter in terms of the sanctions approach, and it certainly does matter in terms of what kind of assistance is rendered in cooperation militarily, in exerting leverage.
Okay, we'll start one more up front before heading to the back.
Hi, Jock Mendoza-Wilson from System Capital Management Group in Ukraine. It's the business group owned by the Ukrainian businessman Renat Akhmetov. I was fascinated by this discussion on sanctions and whether those could be expanded. As you all know, at the beginning of this month, our business group, along with many others, lost numerous assets in non-government controlled territory. In fact, we lost 16 businesses, and I think an estimate in total across all businesses, not just our own, $2 billion worth of assets were lost, which brought $3 billion of income into Ukraine. Surely this is a great opportunity to examine those who have, and I know the word nationalized has been used, but let me be very clear, those assets were not nationalized. They were seized by armed force and expropriated, which in my view is not nationalization but theft. This is surely a clear opportunity to identify where possible those individuals, organizations or governments which played a role or part in that, and add them quickly to the sanctions list, because this type of action should not be rewarded but rather immediately taken care of. Thanks.
Anyone want to respond?
Makes sense.
There was a question for you from
I think
former Minister Uresco asking you if you have a list.
Do I have a list? Sorry, without the microphone. Yeah, we have a detailed list, a detailed action plan.
We have a detailed list, and we have a detailed action plan for legal action, both in Ukraine, which is necessary to take in order to establish the fact that those assets have been stolen, and we will take rigorous legal action in all territories. And we have already written to those people who may potentially be beneficiaries of those stolen assets to advise them of their legal responsibilities of due diligence when accepting either stolen assets or products which may have come from those stolen assets. So we will be very vigorous in our defence, and we look forward to the international community being supportive also of that action.
over here.
Elaine Soreo, Associate Rector for WIUU in Kiev, Ukraine. I thank you for that lead-in on the private sector. I really wanted to ask a tie-in in terms of Ambassador Dobronovsky and Dr. Levinchenko. Right now, how would you see the addressing of cybersecurity and energy security that could be developed through U.S. private sector in partnership with Ukrainian private sector to deliver that security, particularly as it could reinforce or be reinforced by a position of the U.S. government staying firm on the no change of borders statement that was made. Would you like to address that, please?
He wants me to go first. I will defer to you on the issue of cybersecurity, but with regard to energy, I think that energy is... My mic is on me.
You just get close to your mouth.
Well, it's as high as it goes. I'll try to speak up. All right, sorry. I think the volume has gone up. I didn't have volume. On energy, I think that energy is a key issue for Ukraine. I'm sure you heard earlier that in terms of sectoral reforms, there have been some significant reforms and changes that have been made in this sector, which I think can only benefit Ukraine in terms of its access to energy. I also have been very impressed in terms of Europe as a whole, particularly Central Europe, has also been coming forward with some very creative ideas in ensuring that energy sources get to Ukraine. And I believe it was said, I think in your statistic, am I correct in saying that this year was, I think, one of the first years where there was a lack of reliance, as you pointed out. So I think it's on a very good trajectory. Sorry? Over 500 days. A very good trajectory in the energy sector. And I'll leave cyber to you.
Thank you so much. You see, unfortunately, Ukraine became a training field for new military technologies, and in cybersphere as well. And if you know, for last 2 years, two last Decembers, we met a full-scale, huge-scale cyber attack on our energy sector, transport, financial sector, banking, etc. It forced us to implement a very strict measures on March of 2016. The President Poroshenko signed the cyber strategy. We defined responsibility of state bodies, and now we are working on development of state-private partnership in this sphere. Of course, we have a huge problem with this, and I'm very thankful for NATO, for US, for other Western countries for help us in cybersecurity sphere. But we are working, and the situation in December of 2016 demonstrate that we achieved some real progress in this sphere, because we managed to address this cyber incident, this cyber threats in this year much quicker and much more effective than it was 1 year ago. But what I want to insist, only with partnership, with close cooperation with NATO, with European Union, with US, we can defend our cyber assets as well, and your cyber assets, because it's too difficult to divide cyberspace by national borders.
We've got time for one more round of questions. I'll take 3 questions. If you can limit your intervention to a question only, I'd appreciate it. We get one more round of discussion. There in the back.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tanya Kalmakova. I'm a reporter for news agency RIA Novosti. Thank you very much for interesting discussion. On the first panel session, Mr. Ambassador Valery Chalov said that it would be very bad if American administration cut financial international aid, specifically for Ukraine. So do you think that international and military aid to Ukraine will remain at the same level, or probably will be increased? And follow-up question about Mr. Tillerson visit to Ukraine, if that might happen anytime soon. And my question is to Ms. Brink. Thank you very much.
Right here.
My name's Jim Green.
Wait for the mic. You can wait for the mic.
Hi, my name's Jim Green. I was chief of mission for NATO from 2004 to 2009, the last time there was a real opportunity. Have the pleasure of working with the Erasmus Club Center still as a visiting fellow. The question I have is, to what extent has the U.S. failure to really provide strong military support early, this sort of creeping slowness of a little bit of this and a little bit of that, spoiled some of the leverage that we might have had in areas like countering corruption and legal changes and that sort of thing? And would an acceleration make a difference in having more influence in Ukraine, meeting Ambassador Herbst's request, or push for more weapons, lethal defensive weapons. On the other side, it's well known that there are certain key people that are blocking reform and that are capable, even in the military area, in the area of corruption, and everyone knows who they are, and everyone knows the old thinking. Is it possible that some action in this area of getting beyond this could, from the American point of view, help accelerate support for Ukraine?
Last question. Right here.
Hello, my name is Vadim Panasuk. I work with Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America on their Rapid Response Referral Program, but I'm here as a private citizen. My question is for Mr. Alexander. From where I'm sitting, I see that Crimea is firmly in Russian hands, and the Ukrainian official position is that Crimea must be returned. Under what conditions do you see that happening, and what would, influence Russia, or through what kind of action, that would happen? And moving on to Donbass, in terms of the humanitarian question there. It is my understanding that Donbass is administered by a military administration, not a civilian one. However, the people of Donbass are still Ukrainian people, as far as everyone should be concerned, in my opinion. What measures are we doing to keep, and what kind of political discourse are we having in terms of separatism and everything else that would, and what kind of actions are we taking in terms of any olive branches, in terms of any actions to kind of keep the population from firmly going into the hands of Russian-influenced forces and kind of slipping out of Ukrainian hands? Thank you.
So we've got about 5 minutes to hit questions on will aid be cut or increased for Ukraine, the potential for a Secretary of State or other U.S. official visit to Ukraine, military and defense equipment as leverage for domestic reforms in Ukraine, and finally conditions for Crimean return and Donbass. And again, feel free to answer any or all of the questions at your leisure.
Let me just, for a matter of time, make two comments. First, about the financial assistance from the United States. If we look at the numbers and you compare the numbers that Ukraine spent on its defense, I would say that probably this is not a matter of numbers. This is a matter of fact that we have military assistance, financial assistance from the United States, and it shows a great support. It shows that we are on the right side. Second point about reform obstacles. We often talk about corrupt officials, about different things, and low-level professionals. But let me tell you that those people who sometimes are not so enthusiastic about changes, about advices given by international or civil society activists, they do not necessarily corrupt, or they are not like all thinkers. Because, for instance, I can give you one example of state border reform in Ukraine. The state border reform in Ukraine was the most successful one until 2014. But in 2014, we figured out that this model of the European police border service was not capable to perform its duty on the Eastern Front. So my point is that sometimes people who are reluctant to reform, they actually guide it with very good incentives. So we should also keep in mind this when we make strong comments or assessments about reform progress and people or sabotage of reforms in Ukraine.
I want to answer for Mr. Panasuk. First of all, I want to insist that Crimea has been, is, and will be an integral part of Ukrainian national territory, and I do believe that Russia will return this under the international pressure, under the change of Russian domestic policy, and or which one I don't No. I think that the most important task for Ukraine right now to help people, Ukrainian citizens, people who lives in Crimea, who lives in Crimea, to defend their rights. You know how many human rights abuse Russian occupation power makes in Crimea. I mentioned about Crimea Tatars people who are targeted by Russian secret police. I mentioned about Ukrainian activists, etc. When we are speaking about Donbass situation, of course, people who live on Donbass has been, are, and will be Ukrainian citizens. And of course, I can't say that we do what we have to do, and we have many problems with humanitarian issues, with economic, etc. But the intentions of Ukrainian government, all Ukrainian official documents, all citations have only one very important priority: to defend rights and interests of people who are under the occupation now. From my point of view, people who live in Donbass is the biggest victims of Russian aggression, who forced them to be in extremely difficult economic, political situation, under pressure of illegal power, under their political rights, and now not only political but economic rights, under huge press from Russian and Russian-backed separatists.
I will just make a quick comment about the failure to provide assistance earlier. I think it was more directed to Ambassador Herbst, but as I heard the question, but I'd say that, you know, in hindsight, I think there were things that we could have done, we should have done, in all the different sectors, be it the military sector and the request for the lethal weaponry, looking at the range of sanctions that were deployed, no less ultimately what came out of the NATO decision-making, you know, in terms of the forward deployment of troops. So, you know, always in hindsight you can, and I think there were missed opportunities. But I also want to add in the mix something, and I carried the statement that Secretary Tillerson made, because I thought it was a very potent statement. He also made a point which you touched upon, and that is, he says, it serves no purpose for Ukraine to fight for its body in Donbass if it loses its soul to corruption. Because you're also, in your statement, I heard that component, at least I think I did, in terms of also the kinds of steps that also must be afoot in Ukraine. And I think that that was also part of the analysis at the time of what one does, how one does it, in also at the same time that Ukraine undertakes reforms. I would say that it's easy to look in hindsight. I think that in terms of all of these sectors, I think that certainly there's a recognition of Ukraine's importance and how all of these areas will matter for its future.
I think first, it's quite possible there will be a drop in aid to Ukraine this year, and I'm sorry to say that. But if it happens, it will happen not because of factors relating to Ukraine, but because of American domestic politics, cutting spending. I would strongly oppose linking military support to Ukraine for reform. We have a vital interest in giving the Kremlin a bloody nose in Ukraine, and that's why we should be also keeping our commitment to Ukraine under the Budapest Memorandum, and that's why we should provide military support for Ukraine. On Crimea, it's not going to be returned anytime soon, but our policy is going to be like our policy in the Baltic states, and that will get Ukraine back Crimea at some point down the road. Last point, not related to the question, something I should have mentioned earlier. Something everyone should be aware of is that some idiot serving Kremlin interest, either from stupidity or from something else, snuck into the Defense Act last year, the defense budget, a provision saying we should provide no man-pads, portable missiles to Ukraine because they're fascist in the Ukrainian military. This should be removed from defense spending to open the way for providing these weapon systems to Ukraine for defensive purposes. And some investigative reporter should seek out the people who did that and ask them why they did it. Thank you.
So just to answer, I think, a couple of these questions. With regard to the budget cuts, I have to say I agree with Ambassador Herbst that the President's budget is going to be slimmer than previous budgets. Obviously, this is something that Congress then appropriates, but my anticipation is that we will have a smaller budget across the board, and the State Department and our foreign assistance is the part of that budget that's getting a very serious cut. Part of being a good news story is implementing reforms and having reforms go forward. And this goes to, I think, the question from someone here about people who may be in the way of reforms. And I would just say, sitting here, you have former Minister Juresko, one of the key reformers, and there are many, many people out there who have contributed to the success of Ukraine so far. And to make the best argument and to help me make the best argument in terms of U.S. support, financial assistance support to Ukraine, those reformers need to be supported, need to continue. And anyone who's not in that camp, it is only undermining U.S. support, international support, and U.S. investment. With regard to a visit, thank you, Oksana. Noted, I've got it, I've got the request. I would say that we have tried to make sure, and our principals and cabinet members have tried to make sure that Ukraine is at the top of the agenda. So President Trump has talked to President Poroshenko on the telephone. Vice President Pence had the opportunity to meet President Poroshenko in Munich, and Secretary Tillerson also has been able to meet Foreign Minister Klimkin here. We will continue to have as robust a meeting schedule as possible, and considering that where we are in the administration, I'm happy that we're at a point where we've had a very strong high-level dialogue, and I should expect that will continue. So thank you.
I want to thank all of you for your interest and questions, and particularly thank the panelists for your pointed remarks. I thought it was a great group. The Trump administration clearly is going to be faced with a wide array of challenges, but inevitably Russia and Ukraine is an issue that they're not going to be able to ignore. And as Bridget said in the back room, there's views that the State Department is sitting on its hands, but the people that are covering these issues on Ukraine and Russia are very busy. And Bridget has just returned. Her boss is heading out, and I do believe we're going to have a Putin and Trump summit this year. So clearly, the more that is in the public eye on this issue, the more the administration in the U.S. will have to come on what its policy will be. And I think all of us hope that the U.S. will continue to play a robust role and that we can get to some sort of positive resolution of the conflict. And again, thanks for all your patience, and look forward to the afternoon panel to come. Thanks.